The rope burned against Theresa Allen's wrists as Sheriff Morton dragged her through the dusty main street of Johnson City, Texas. And she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to end before it had truly begun. It was August 1878, and the scorching sun beat down mercilessly on her dark hair as townspeople emerged from shops and saloons to witness her humiliation, their faces twisted with judgment and disgust. She had arrived in this town only 3 weeks ago, seeking honest work as a seamstress after her father's death left her alone in the world. And now, she was being accused of stealing $200 from the general store where she had been employed. "I didn't take anything," Theresa said for what felt like the 100th time, her voice hoarse from pleading. "Please, you have to believe me." Sheriff Morton, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained teeth and cold eyes, jerked her forward roughly. "Save it for the judge, girl. We found the money hidden in your boarding room, plain as day. Mrs. Henderson saw you acting suspicious yesterday evening, lurking near the cash box." Theresa's heart hammered against her ribs. The money had been planted. She was certain of it. But who would believe a 20-year-old woman with no family and no connections over the respected shop owner Mr. Caldwell and his wife? She had seen the triumph in Mrs. Caldwell's eyes when the sheriff discovered the bills tucked inside Theresa's pillowcase, and she understood then that this had been planned from the beginning. But why? What had she done to earn such hatred? The crowd grew larger as they approached the jailhouse, voices rising in anger and calls for immediate justice. Theresa's legs trembled beneath her simple cotton dress, now soiled from being thrown to the ground during her arrest. She thought of her father, who had raised her with kindness and integrity after her mother's death in childbirth, and wondered what he would think if he could see her now, accused of a crime that went against everything he had taught her. "Sheriff, wait." The voice cut through the chaos like a knife, deep and commanding, and the crowd fell silent almost immediately. Theresa lifted her head and saw a man pushing through the gathered townspeople, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that fell just past his collar. He wore dusty riding clothes and a worn leather vest, and there was something in his angular face that spoke of both strength and unexpected gentleness. His eyes, a startling shade of green, fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This doesn't concern you, Sullivan," Sheriff Morton said, his tone instantly more respectful despite his words. "The girl's caught red-handed. Justice will be served. Justice." The man called Sullivan stepped closer, and Theresa noticed the way people moved aside for him, a mixture of respect and wariness in their expressions. "Or a lynching. I know what happens when this town decides someone's guilty before a trial." "There's evidence," the sheriff insisted, but his grip on Theresa's arm had loosened slightly. "The money was found in her possession." Sullivan Anderson moved until he stood directly in front of Theresa, studying her face with such focus that she felt exposed, as though he could see straight into her soul. His gaze traveled to her bound wrists, to the bruise forming on her cheekbone where Mrs. Caldwell had struck her during the confrontation, and something dark and dangerous flashed across his features. "I know the truth," Sullivan said quietly, his eyes never leaving Theresa's face. "Come with me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and yet somehow inevitable. Theresa stared at this stranger who was offering her salvation without knowing anything about her, and she saw in his expression something that made her believe him completely. He knew something, had seen something, and he was willing to stand against the entire town for her. "Now you wait just a minute," Sheriff Morton sputtered, his face reddening. "You can't just take a prisoner. I don't care who your father was or what kind of reputation you've built. The law is the law." Sullivan finally tore his gaze from Theresa and fixed the sheriff with a look that could have frozen water in the August heat. "Then, uphold the law properly, Morton. Give her a fair chance to defend herself. Or are you so eager to please the Caldwells that you'll ignore the truth when it's staring you in the face?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Theresa realized that Sullivan Anderson was not just any cowboy or rancher. He held significant influence in this town, enough that even the sheriff had to consider his words carefully. Her mind raced, trying to understand what he could possibly know about her situation when they had never met before. "What truth?" Mr. Caldwell pushed forward, his round face flushed with anger and something else, something that might have been fear. "The girl is a thief. My wife witnessed her suspicious behavior, and the money was found in her room. What more proof do you need, Sullivan? Or has a pretty face clouded your judgment?" Sullivan's jaw tightened. "I was in your store 2 nights ago, Caldwell, late after closing. I needed supplies for an early morning ride, and you were kind enough to accommodate me. Or don't you remember?" The shop owner's face went pale, and Theresa saw his wife grab his arm, her knuckles white. "I remember," Caldwell said slowly, "but I don't see what that has to do with anything." "I saw your son, Paul, at the cash box," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd. "I didn't think much of it at the time, figured he was helping with the accounts. But then I heard this morning that money had gone missing, and suddenly a new employee was being accused. Seemed mighty convenient, especially given that your son's been running up gambling debts at the saloon for months now." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Theresa felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Paul Caldwell, the shop owner's spoiled 19-year-old son, had a reputation she had quickly learned to avoid. He had made unwanted advances toward her during her first week of employment, following her to the boarding house and making crude suggestions that had terrified her. When she had firmly rejected him, his charming facade had cracked, revealing something cruel and vindictive underneath. "That's a lie," Mrs. Caldwell shrieked, her carefully maintained composure shattering. "My Paul would never steal from his own family. This is absurd. She's bewitched you somehow, made you see things that never happened." Sullivan shook his head. "I know what I saw. And I know that Paul was in the store late last night too, because I saw his horse tied up outside when I rode past around midnight. That's when the money was really taken, isn't it? And then it was hidden in Miss Allen's room to place the blame on someone who couldn't defend herself." Sheriff Morton's expression had changed from certainty to doubt. He looked between the Caldwells and Sullivan, clearly weighing the word of a respected rancher against that of the town's shop owners. Theresa held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this nightmare might actually end. "These are serious accusations, Anderson," the sheriff said finally. "You're saying the Caldwell boy framed this girl. I'm saying that before you lock up an innocent woman, you might want to question Paul and find out where he really was last night. Check his pockets, check his room. I'm willing to bet you'll find either more of that missing money or evidence of where it went. Probably straight to paying off Eddie Hart at the card tables." Mr. Caldwell seemed to shrink into himself, and Theresa knew in that moment that Sullivan was right. The shop owner knew his son was guilty, had probably known all along, but had been willing to sacrifice an innocent woman to protect his family's reputation and his son from consequences. "Paul was home last night," Mrs. Caldwell insisted, but her voice had lost its conviction. "He was home with us." "Then you won't mind if the sheriff verifies that," Sullivan said. His hand moved to Theresa's shoulder, a gentle touch that somehow conveyed both protection and promise. "In the meantime, I'm taking Miss Allen into my custody. She'll stay at my ranch until this matter is properly investigated." If you have a problem with that, Morton, you can take it up with Judge Harrison when he arrives next week." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue, but the crowd's mood had shifted. People were now muttering about Paul Caldwell's gambling problem, about how strange it was that the money had been found so conveniently, about how the Anderson family had never been known to lie. Sullivan's father had been a legendary figure in Johnson City before his death 5 years ago, a man who had helped build the town and establish law and order. His son carried that legacy, and people trusted him. "Fine," Sheriff Morton said, pulling a knife from his belt to cut Theresa's bonds. "But she doesn't leave town, Anderson. You're responsible for her until this is sorted out, and if you're wrong about this, if she runs, it'll be on your head." The rope fell away and Theresa gasped as blood rushed back into her hands. She rubbed her raw wrists, unable to quite believe what had just happened. Sullivan's hand remained on her shoulder, steady and warm, anchoring her to reality. "She won't run," Sullivan said quietly, and when Theresa looked up at him, she saw absolute certainty in his eyes. "Because she's innocent, and innocent people don't run from the truth." He guided her through the crowd, which parted before them like a river around stone. Theresa's legs felt weak, her entire body shaking with relief and residual fear, but Sullivan's presence beside her kept her moving forward. She was aware of the stares, the whispers, the judgment that still lingered in some faces, but she was also aware of the man who had just risked his reputation to save her life. A beautiful Palomino mare stood tied to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, and Sullivan led Theresa toward it. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice gentler now that they were away from the crowd. "Yes," Theresa managed, her throat tight with emotion. "My father taught me when I was young, but I don't understand. Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. You don't know if I'm really innocent." Sullivan untied the mare and then turned to face her fully, and the impact of his gaze at close range nearly stole her breath. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of honest work under the sun. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow and another along his jawline, marks of a life that had not been easy, but his eyes held a kindness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "I know enough," he said. "I know that Paul Caldwell is a spoiled coward who takes what he wants and blames others when he's caught. I know that you've been working hard since you arrived in town, keeping to yourself and never causing trouble. And I know what I saw that night in the store. Paul was taking money from the cash box and looking guilty as sin while he did it. I should have said something then, but I thought maybe his father had given him permission. I didn't realize he was stealing from his own family until I heard about your arrest this morning." Theresa felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, not here in the middle of town where people were still watching. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die today. I thought no one would believe me and they would hang me or worse." Something painful flickered across Sullivan's face. "That's not going to happen. You're safe now. I give you my word." He helped her onto the mare with careful hands, mindful of her injuries, and then swung up behind her. Theresa stiffened at the intimacy of their position, his arms coming around her to take the reins, his chest solid against her back. But there was nothing improper in his touch, only protection and steady strength, and gradually she allowed herself to relax slightly. They rode out of town in silence, heading west toward the rolling hills that bordered Johnson City. The August heat was oppressive, the air thick and still, and Theresa could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her dress. But it was freedom, real and tangible, and she breathed it in like water after a drought. The Anderson ranch appeared after about 30 minutes of riding, and Theresa caught her breath at the sight of it. The main house was larger than she had expected, built of solid timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Corrals and outbuildings spread out behind it, and she could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. It spoke of prosperity and careful management, a legacy maintained through hard work. Sullivan dismounted and then helped Theresa down, his hands spanning her waist. She stumbled slightly, her legs unsteady, and he caught her easily, holding her until she found her balance. Their faces were inches apart, and Theresa found herself lost in the green depths of his eyes, seeing questions there that matched her own confusion, and the strange pull she felt toward this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. "You should rest," Sullivan said, stepping back, though she thought she saw reluctance in the movement. "You've been through hell today. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, will get you settled in one of the guest rooms. You'll be safe here, Miss Allen. I promise you that." "Theresa," she said softly. "Please call me Theresa. After what you've done for me, formality seems absurd." A slow smile transformed his face, and Theresa felt her heart skip in response. "Theresa," he repeated, and her name sounded different in his voice, like something precious. "I'm Sullivan, though most people call me Sully. Welcome to the Anderson Ranch. I only wish it was under better circumstances." Mrs. Chen turned out to be a small, efficient woman in her 50s with kind eyes and quick movements. She clucked disapprovingly over Theresa's bruises and raw wrists, immediately taking charge and leading her upstairs to a comfortable room with a real bed and clean linens that smelled of lavender. Hot water was brought for washing, and a simple but clean dress was provided, one that Mrs. Chen explained had belonged to Sullivan's late mother. "Mr. Anderson, he is good man," Mrs. Chen said as she helped Theresa clean her wounds with gentle hands. "His father raised him right, taught him to stand up for what is just. He sees you accused unfairly. He cannot stand by and do nothing. This is his way." "He barely knows me," Theresa said, wincing as the cloth touched a particularly tender spot on her wrist. "Why would he risk so much for a stranger?" Mrs. Chen smiled mysteriously. "Perhaps you not so much stranger as you think. Mr. Anderson, he notices things. He sees you in town these past weeks, working hard, keeping head down. He tells me just yesterday that new seamstress at Caldwell store seems like good person, someone who understands struggle. And then today, he hears you arrested and he knows something not right, so he acts. This is who he is." Theresa absorbed this information, her mind reeling. Sullivan had noticed her, had thought about her. She tried to remember if she had ever seen him during her brief time in Johnson City. But her memory of those weeks was blurred by exhaustion and the constant worry about making enough money to pay for her room and meals. She had been so focused on survival that she had barely looked at the people around her. After Mrs. Chen left her to rest, Theresa lay in the comfortable bed and stared at the ceiling, her thoughts churning. Everything had changed so quickly. This morning, she had woken believing it would be another difficult but ordinary day of work. Now she was lying in a stranger's home, saved from a horrific fate by a man who claimed to know the truth. The rope burns on her wrists throbbed, a physical reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. Sleep came eventually, pulled down by exhaustion and stress. And when Theresa woke, the sun was setting, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. She rose stiffly, her body protesting every movement, and made her way downstairs, following the sounds of quiet conversation and the smell of cooking food. Sullivan stood in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, discussing something in low tones, but he turned immediately when Theresa appeared in the doorway. His eyes swept over her, checking for signs of distress, and she saw relief when he found her looking somewhat better than before. "How are you feeling?" he asked, pulling out a chair at the large wooden table that dominated the kitchen. "Mrs. Chen has made enough food to feed the entire county as usual. You should eat something." Theresa realized she was starving, having had nothing since a meager breakfast at dawn before her arrest. She sat gratefully and accepted a plate piled with beef, potatoes, and vegetables, and for several minutes she ate in silence while Sullivan watched her with an expression she could not quite read. "The sheriff came by while you were sleeping," Sullivan said finally, leaning back in his chair. "They questioned Paul Caldwell. He broke down almost immediately and confessed to taking the money to pay gambling debts. Apparently, he planned to blame you from the start. He stole the money, hid it in your room, and had his mother pretend she saw you acting suspicious to make the accusation believable." Theresa set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone despite the delicious food. "Why me? What did I do to him?" Sullivan's jaw tightened. "According to Paul, you embarrassed him by rejecting his advances. He thought you should have been grateful for his attention, given your circumstances. When you made it clear you wanted nothing to do with him, he decided to punish you. The missing money was just an opportunity he took advantage of." Rage, hot and sharp, flooded through Theresa. She had been almost hanged, almost murdered because a spoiled boy could not handle rejection. The injustice of it made her hands shake, and she clenched them in her lap to hide the tremor. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will he be arrested? Will there be a trial?" Paul has been taken into custody. His parents tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence is clear. The sheriff found more money in Paul's room, and several people came forward to verify his gambling debts. He'll be tried when Judge Harrison arrives next week. As for you, all charges have been dropped. You're free, Theresa, completely free." The words should have brought relief, and they did, but they also brought a wave of uncertainty that left Theresa feeling unmoored. Free to do what? Return to the boarding house where everyone now knew she had been accused of theft. Try to find work in a town where her name had been dragged through the dirt. She had no money saved, no resources, no plan beyond surviving one day at a time. Sullivan seemed to read her thoughts in her face. "You don't have to go back to town," he said quietly. "Not right away, at least. You can stay here while you figure out what you want to do next. The ranch always needs extra hands, and Mrs. Chen could use help with the housework and cooking. It would be honest work, and you would be paid fairly." Theresa looked up at him, searching his face for signs of pity or charity, but she found only sincerity. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. "You saved my life today, you've given me shelter, and now you're offering me work. I don't understand what you could possibly gain from helping me this way." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, and Theresa saw something complicated pass through his eyes, something that made her breath catch. "Maybe I don't need to gain anything," he said finally. "Maybe doing the right thing is enough. Or maybe I'm tired of seeing good people crushed by those with more power and fewer scruples. My father spent his life building this town into a place where justice mattered, where hard work was rewarded and honesty valued. Watching the Caldwells try to destroy you to protect their worthless son made me sick. I couldn't stand by and let it happen." "Is that all?" Theresa asked, emboldened by something in his voice, some note that suggested deeper feelings he was not voicing. Sullivan held her gaze for a heartbeat too, and then looked away. "No," he admitted. "That's not all. The truth is, I've noticed you since you first arrived in Johnson City. I've seen you walking to work each morning with your head held high despite your circumstances. I've seen you help Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries when she was struggling, and I've watched you give part of your meager lunch to that stray dog that hangs around the boarding house. You're kind and strong and honest, and those are rare qualities. When I heard you had been arrested, something in me knew immediately that it was wrong, that you were being falsely accused. So yes, I helped you because it was right, but I also helped you because I couldn't bear the thought of you being hurt. Theresa felt heat rise in her cheeks, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty, such open emotion. In her 20 years, she had never experienced anything like the connection she felt building between them, this impossible intimacy with a man she had known for less than a day. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Sullivan replied, standing abruptly as though he had revealed too much too quickly. "Just think about my offer. You can stay as long as you need to. No pressure, no expectations. I just want you to have the chance to rebuild your life without fear." He left the kitchen then, and Theresa sat alone with her cooling dinner and her racing thoughts. Mrs. Chen appeared to clear the plates, her knowing smile suggesting she had heard at least part of the conversation, but she said nothing, simply patted Theresa's shoulder in a gesture of comfort and encouragement. That night, lying once again in the comfortable guest room, Theresa made her decision. She would stay, at least for a while. She would accept Sullivan's offer of work and use the opportunity to save money and plan her future. But more than that, she would allow herself to explore this strange and powerful connection she felt with the man who had saved her life. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this feeling that her world had tilted on its axis the moment Sullivan Anderson had said those fateful words. "I know the truth. Come with me." The following days fell into a gentle rhythm that Theresa had never experienced before. She woke early to help Mrs. Chen with breakfast for Sullivan and the ranch hands, discovering that she enjoyed cooking far more than she had ever enjoyed sewing. She cleaned and organized, tended the kitchen garden, and learned to churn butter and bake bread that actually rose instead of turning into heavy bricks. Mrs. Chen was a patient teacher, and Theresa absorbed everything like parched earth soaking up rain. Sullivan was often out working with the cattle or mending fences or dealing with the 1,000 tasks that came with running a successful ranch. But in the evenings, he would return dusty and tired, and they would share dinner together, sometimes with Mrs. Chen joining them, sometimes alone. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared opinions on books and differing views on politics. Sullivan told her about his father, about growing up on the ranch and learning to value hard work and integrity above all else. Theresa shared memories of her own father, of the quiet life they had lived before his illness took him, and Sullivan listened with such genuine interest that she found herself revealing things she had never told anyone. One week after her rescue, on a warm evening when the cicadas sang their endless song and the stars spread across the sky like diamonds on velvet, Sullivan asked Theresa to walk with him. They strolled away from the house toward a small rise that overlooked the ranch, the town visible as scattered lights in the distance. The August heat had finally broken slightly, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of prairie grass and distant water. "Judge Harrison arrived today," Sullivan said as they walked. "Paul Caldwell was tried this afternoon. He received 2 years in prison for theft and another year for filing a false accusation. His parents are devastated, of course, but the judge was clear that there have to be consequences for such actions." "Good," Theresa said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "I know I should feel sorry for them, but I can't. They were willing to let me hang for something their son did. They don't deserve sympathy." "No," Sullivan agreed. "They don't, though I think they'll suffer enough living with the knowledge of what they almost did. The whole town knows the truth now, and the Caldwell's reputation is destroyed. They're talking about selling the store and moving east to live with Mrs. Caldwell's sister. They reached the top of the rise and stood together, looking out over the land that was lit silver by the moon. Theresa was intensely aware of Sullivan beside her, of the space between them that felt both too large and dangerously small. Over the past week, her feelings had grown from gratitude and attraction into something deeper, something that terrified her with its intensity. She had never been in love before, but she thought this aching awareness, this constant desire to be near him, to know his thoughts and share his smiles, must be what the poets wrote about. "Theresa," Sullivan said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn to face him fully. In the moonlight, his features were all shadow and silver, beautiful and serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer is not what I hope to hear." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "These past days with you here have been the best I can remember in years. Coming home knowing you'll be there, talking with you over dinner, hearing your laugh when Mrs. Chen tells one of her stories, it's all made me realize something. I don't want you to leave. Not just because you need a place to stay or because I feel responsible for you. I don't want you to leave because I've fallen in love with you, Theresa Allen, and I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." Theresa stared at him, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. He loved her. This strong, kind man who had saved her life, who had given her shelter and work and friendship, loved her. And she loved him too, she realized, had been falling in love with him since the moment he stood up for her in the street. Perhaps even before that, in those brief glimpses, she now remembered seeing of him in town during her first weeks in Johnson City. "I know it's too soon," Sullivan continued, misreading her silence. "I know you've been through trauma and you need time to heal. I'm not asking you to make any promises or decisions. I just needed you to know how I feel. If you want to leave, if you want to go somewhere else and start fresh without any connection to what happened here, I'll understand. But if there's any chance you might feel even a fraction of what I feel, then I'm asking you to stay. Not as an employee or a guest, but as someone I'm courting with honorable intentions. Someone I hope might someday consider becoming my wife." The last word hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and hope and the future itself. Theresa felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of joy, of relief, of finding something she had not known she was searching for. "Sully," she whispered, using the nickname for the first time, and she saw the way his eyes lit up at the sound of it. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said you knew the truth, when you offered me hope in my darkest hour. These days here with you have been a gift I never expected. You make me laugh and you make me feel safe, and you make me want to believe in futures and possibilities again. So yes, I'll stay. I'll stay and let you court me, and I'll tell you right now that I can't imagine saying no when you eventually ask me to marry you." The smile that broke across Sullivan's face was like sunrise after a long night. He reached for her then, his hands cupping her face with such gentleness that more tears spilled over, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. It was her first real kiss, and it tasted like freedom and home and the promise of everything good that life could offer. She kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding in, all the gratitude and love and desperate joy, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. "I love you," Sullivan said again, resting his forehead against hers. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the gift you're giving me by staying." "You already proved that," Theresa replied, her hands resting on his chest, feeling his heart beating fast beneath her palm. "You saved my life, Sully." not just from the noose, but from a life of loneliness and fear. You gave me hope and a future. I'm the one who should be proving myself worthy. We'll spend our lives proving it to each other, Sullivan said, and he kissed her again. Slower this time, deeper, a promise sealed between them under the Texas stars. The courtship that followed was the happiest time Theresa had ever known. Sullivan courted her properly, with Sunday rides into the countryside and carefully chaperoned dinners in town where they made their relationship public. There was gossip, of course, whispers about the scandalous speed of their romance and speculation about Sullivan's motivations. But Sullivan faced down the talk with the same quiet strength he had shown when defending Theresa from the false accusations, making it clear to everyone that he was courting her because he loved her, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him directly. Mrs. Chen was delighted, throwing herself into preparations for the wedding that everyone knew was coming. She taught Theresa more about running a household, about managing accounts and dealing with suppliers, all the practical skills she would need as a rancher's wife. But more than that, she became the mother figure Theresa had lost so long ago, offering wisdom and comfort and unconditional support. 3 months after that first kiss under the stars, on a crisp November evening when the air held the first hints of coming winter, Sullivan took Theresa back to that same rise overlooking the ranch. He had arranged for a picnic, despite the cooling temperatures, with blankets and hot cider and Mrs. Chen's best food. They ate and talked and laughed, and then Sullivan took her hand and dropped to one knee, pulling out a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple band with a small sapphire that caught the fading light. "Theresa Allen," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "You walked into my life in the worst possible circumstances, and you turned it into something more beautiful than I ever imagined. You're strong and kind and brave, and I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you as happy as you make me. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the person I come home to every evening?" "Yes," Theresa said, the word coming out somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I'll marry you, Sullivan Anderson, and I'll love you until my dying day and beyond." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. They kissed as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold and orange. And Theresa thought about how strange life was, how the worst day of her existence had led directly to the best. If she had not been falsely accused, if Sullivan had not stepped in to save her, they might never have found each other. She could not be grateful for the trauma and injustice she had suffered, but she could be grateful for the outcome, for this love that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. They were married 6 weeks later, on a cold January morning in 1879, in the small church at the center of Johnson City. Nearly the entire town attended, partly because the Anderson family commanded such respect, and partly because everyone was curious about the woman who had captured Sullivan's heart. Theresa wore a dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and sleeves, and she carried wildflowers that Sullivan had ridden out at dawn to pick for her. She walked down the aisle alone, with no father to give her away, but she felt her father's presence like a blessing, and she knew he would have approved of the man waiting for her at the altar. Sullivan stood tall and handsome in his best suit, his dark hair freshly cut, his green eyes shining with love and pride as he watched her approach. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was absolute, and when Sullivan kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheering. They were married, husband and wife, bound together by love and law, and the shared experience of having fought for justice and found each other in the process. The reception at the ranch was a joyful affair, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Sullivan's ranch hands toasted the couple with genuine affection, and even some of the townspeople who had been quickest to judge Theresa during her arrest came to offer congratulations and apologies. Theresa accepted their words with grace, choosing to focus on the future rather than dwelling on past hurts. She danced with her husband, her head resting on his shoulder, and felt such perfect contentment that she wondered if it was possible to die from too much happiness. When the last guests had finally left, and they were alone in the house that was now truly their home, Sullivan carried Theresa over the threshold of their bedroom with a grin that made her laugh and blush in equal measure. He set her down gently, and the laughter faded as they looked at each other, the reality of their marriage suddenly very real and immediate. "Are you nervous?" Sullivan asked softly, his hands resting on her waist. "A little," Theresa admitted, "but not afraid, never afraid with you." "I love you," Sullivan said. And then he showed her with gentle hands and patient kisses exactly what those words meant. And Theresa discovered that physical love could be as beautiful and transcendent as the emotional connection they had built over the past months. Life as Sullivan's wife exceeded every dream Theresa had ever dared to have. She threw herself into running the household and helping manage the ranch, discovering that she had a natural head for business and organization. Sullivan valued her opinions and consulted her on major decisions, treating her as a true partner rather than simply a wife to be protected and managed. They worked together during the days and fell into each other's arms at night, their love deepening with every shared experience, every challenge overcome together. Mrs. Chen remained with them, becoming Theresa's closest friend and confidant. The older woman taught her the secrets of running a ranch house, of managing employees and budgets, of preserving food for winter and treating minor injuries. But more than that, she taught Theresa about strength, about the quiet power of women who supported their families and communities through hard work and intelligence. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of joy and hard work. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and Sullivan's reputation in the community grew stronger. He became known as a fair man who would always stand up for justice, and people came to him for advice and mediation. Theresa worked alongside him, using her own experiences with injustice to advocate for others who faced similar situations. Together, they became a force for good in Johnson City, a couple whose love story inspired others and whose commitment to fairness and honesty set an example. In the spring of 1880, Theresa discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure, but mostly with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and wonder. Sullivan became even more protective than usual, fussing over Theresa and insisting she rest more, though she laughingly told him that pregnancy was not an illness, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her usual activities. Their first child was born on a crisp October morning, after a labor that lasted through the night and left Theresa exhausted but exhilarated. The baby was a boy, healthy and strong-lunged, with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes. They named him Thomas, after Theresa's father, and when Sullivan held his son for the first time, Theresa saw tears streaming down his face, and she fell in love with him all over again. Thomas was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Sarah, who had Theresa's dark hair and Sullivan's green eyes and a smile that could light up the entire house. The children grew up surrounded by love and laughter, learning from their parents the values of honesty, hard work, and standing up for what was right. Sullivan taught them to ride and rope, while Theresa taught them to read and write and think for themselves. The years passed in a blur of happiness, punctuated by the normal struggles of life. There were hard winters and drought summers, sick cattle and injured horses, disagreements and reconciliations. But through it all, Theresa and Sullivan faced each challenge together, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. They never forgot how they had found each other, never took for granted the gift they had been given. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Sullivan took Theresa back to the rise where he had first told her he loved her, where he had proposed. Their children were with Mrs. Chen for the evening, and they had the whole night to themselves, a rare luxury. They sat together watching the sunset, Sullivan's arm around Theresa's shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "You ever think about that day?" Sullivan asked quietly. "The day I found you being dragged through town, accused and terrified." "Sometimes," Theresa admitted. "It was the worst and best day of my life. Worst because of the fear and injustice, best because it led me to you. I think about how close I came to dying, to never having this life, these children, this love. It makes me treasure every moment even more." "I think about it too," Sullivan said. "I think about what would have happened if I had not been in town that day, if I had not seen Paul stealing the money, if I had kept silent. The thought of you being hurt, of never having you in my life, it's unbearable." Theresa turned to look up at him, seeing the emotion in his face, the love that had only grown deeper over the years. "But you were there. You did see. You didn't keep silent. That's who you are, Sully. A man who stands up for what's right, who protects those who need protecting. That's why I fell in love with you, and that's why I love you more with every passing day." Sullivan kissed her then, tender and deep, and they stayed on the rise long after the stars came out, talking about their past and their future, about their children and their dreams. They made love under the stars, as they had done many times before, but this time felt special, felt like a renewal of the vows they had made 10 years ago. More children came in the following years, 2 more sons and another daughter, until the house was filled with noise and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of a large family. Sullivan and Theresa raised them with love and discipline, teaching them to work hard and treat others with respect. They told their children the story of how they met, how an accusation of theft and a cowboy's intervention had led to a love that changed both their lives. As the children grew and eventually began to leave home, starting families of their own, Sullivan and Theresa found themselves alone again, but not lonely. They had built a life together that was rich and full, surrounded by friends and family and the community they had helped shape. The ranch continued to prosper, now run with the help of their oldest son Thomas, who had inherited his father's love of the land and his mother's business sense. They grew old together, Sullivan's dark hair turning silver, Theresa's face gaining lines that spoke of years of laughter and love. They still walked together in the evenings when the weather permitted, still held hands like young lovers, still found joy in each other's company after decades of marriage. Their grandchildren visited often, filling the house once more with young voices and endless energy, and Sullivan and Theresa delighted in spoiling them and then sending them home to their parents. One warm summer evening in 1915, when they had been married for 36 years and Sullivan was approaching 60, they sat together on the porch of the house that had been their home for so long. Sullivan's health had been declining slowly over the past few years, his body wearing out after a lifetime of hard work, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Theresa as strong as ever. "You have any regrets?" Sullivan asked, his hand clasping hers gently. "Anything you wish had been different?" Theresa thought about the question seriously, looking back over the decades they had shared. She thought about the struggles and the triumphs, the joys and the sorrows, the ordinary days and the extraordinary moments. And she realized that even the hard times had been worth it because they had faced them together. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "Every moment of my life with you has been a gift, Sully. Even the struggles were worth it because they brought us closer together. You saved my life that day in Johnson City, but more than that, you gave me a life worth living. You gave me love and partnership and a family and a purpose. How could I regret any of that?" "I'm the one who should be grateful," Sullivan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have chosen anyone, gone anywhere after you were cleared. But you chose me, chose this life. You made me happier than I ever thought possible. You gave me children and grandchildren and a home filled with love. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Theresa Anderson." They sat together as the sun set, not speaking, not needing to. Their love had long since passed the point where words were necessary. They communicated in glances and touches, in the comfort of simply being together. Theresa rested her head on Sullivan's shoulder, and he pressed a kiss to her hair, and they watched the sky turn from blue to pink to purple to black, studded with stars that had witnessed their entire love story. Sullivan passed away peacefully 3 years later in his sleep, with Theresa holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but not with despair. They had had 39 beautiful years together, a lifetime of love and partnership that most people could only dream of. She had their children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, to comfort her and carry on the legacy they had built together. Theresa lived another decade after Sullivan's death, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She spent her final years telling stories to her great-grandchildren, passing on the history of the family and the lessons she had learned. She told them about justice and integrity, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, about the power of love to transform lives. When Theresa finally passed in her sleep at the age of 79, surrounded by family in the house she and Sullivan had shared, her last thoughts were of that day in August 1878 when her life had almost ended. She thought of the rope on her wrists, the fear in her heart, and then the moment when a tall cowboy had pushed through the crowd and said the words that changed everything. "I know the truth, come with me." She had followed him then, trusting a stranger with her life, and that trust had led to a love story that spanned nearly 4 decades. It had led to children and grandchildren, and a legacy of fairness and compassion that would continue long after she was gone. It had led to a life so full and rich that even now, at the end, she felt only gratitude. Theresa and Sullivan Anderson were buried side by side on the rise overlooking the ranch, the spot where he had first declared his love and later proposed. Their grave became a landmark in Johnson City, a reminder of a love that had overcome injustice and adversity to become something legendary. Couples would visit the site and tell each other the story of the false accusation and the cowboy who had known the truth, who had offered his hand and his heart to a woman the world had condemned. Their children and grandchildren continued to run the ranch for generations, maintaining the values Sullivan and Theresa had instilled. The Anderson family became synonymous with integrity and fairness in Texas, and the story of how the family had truly begun, with a cowboy's intervention and a love that conquered all, was passed down through the years like a precious inheritance. In the end, Theresa and Sullivan's love story became more than just their own. It became a testament to the power of standing up for truth, of trusting in unexpected moments, of allowing yourself to love even when circumstances seem impossible. It proved that from the darkest moments can come the brightest futures, that justice and love are worth fighting for, and that sometimes, when a cowboy says he knows the truth and asks you to come with him, the only right answer is yes. Their love endured beyond their lifetimes, living on in the family they created, the community they shaped, and the countless people who heard their story and found hope in it. It was a love that began with an accusation and an intervention, that grew through adversity and blossomed in partnership, and that ultimately became the foundation for a legacy that would last forever. A love that proved, beyond any doubt, that truth and justice and devotion could triumph over any obstacle, and that sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the beginning of your greatest adventure.